The night my mother died, I was the only one in that hospital room. I held her hand, I heard her last breath. I was the one who called the funeral home at 2 in the morning while my hands were shaking so hard I could barely press the buttons. I did everything, I handled everything. And 3 days later, when the family lawyer read the will out loud in my father-in-law's living room, my name was not in it, not once, not for a single thing. The woman who had lived in that house for 11 years, raised 2 children that were not biologically mine, cared for a dying woman for the last 14 months of her life, and spent every savings account she had to keep that family from falling apart was not mentioned, not even thanked. But what happened next is what I really need you to hear, because the moment I realized my name had been removed was not the worst part. The worst part was realizing it had been removed on purpose. And the person who did it was sitting 3 feet away from me, nodding along like everything was completely normal. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. If you spent 11 years loving people who were quietly planning to cut you out, would you have seen it sooner than I did? Or would you have done exactly what I did and kept making excuses because you loved them? Stay with me, because the answer I found changes everything about how this story ends. If this hits close to home, drop a comment below. I read every single one. The night my mother died, I was the only one in that hospital room. I held her hand, I heard her last breath. I was the one who called the funeral home at 2 in the morning while my hands were shaking so hard I could barely press the buttons. I did everything, I handled everything. And 3 days later, when the family lawyer read the will out loud in my father-in-law's living room, my name was not in it, not once, not for a single thing. The woman who had lived in that house for 11 years, raised 2 children that were not biologically mine, cared for a dying woman for the last 14 months of her life, and spent every savings account she had to keep that family from falling apart was not mentioned, not even thanked. But what happened next is what I really need you to hear, because the moment I realized my name had been removed was not the worst part. The worst part was realizing it had been removed on purpose. And the person who did it was sitting 3 feet away from me, nodding along like everything was completely normal. My name is Ava, and this is the story of how I lost everything I thought I had, and then found out I had something worth so much more than any of them ever wanted me to know about. I need to take you back to the beginning so you understand how deep this goes. I was 26 years old when I met Daniel. He was warm, funny, and easy to be around. He had 2 daughters, Lily, who was 5, and Gracie, who was 3. Their biological mother had left when Gracie was only 7 months old. She had walked out without a note, without a goodbye, without a single phone call to her children for the next 3 years. Daniel had been raising those 2 little girls alone with help from his mother, Margaret. I want you to understand that I knew all of this going in. I was not naive. I knew I was walking into a complicated situation, but I also genuinely fell in love with Daniel and those little girls. Lily used to follow me around the house asking me to braid her hair. Gracie would fall asleep on my shoulder during car rides. I chose them, consciously and completely. Daniel and I got married 2 years later. I was 28, he was 33. It was a small wedding, nothing extravagant, because Daniel had debt from the years he raised the girls alone and I had student loans of my own. We agreed we would build slowly and carefully. I was fine with that. I was genuinely fine with all of it because I thought we were a team. The problems did not start all at once. That is never how these things work. They started as tiny, easy to explain moments that I stored away and tried to forget. The first one came about 4 months into our marriage. Daniel's mother, Margaret, called him one evening to tell him that the roof on the family home needed major repairs. The estimate was $9,000. Daniel came to me that night and said his mother needed help. I said we should sit down and look at what we could contribute together. He nodded. 2 days later, I discovered that he had transferred $6,000 out of our joint account without telling me. When I brought it up, he looked genuinely confused, like I had asked a strange question. He said, "She's my mother, Ava. What was I supposed to do?" I told him the issue wasn't helping his mother. The issue was doing it without telling me. He apologized. He seemed sincere. I let it go. That was my first mistake, not because I should not have forgiven him, but because I did not write it down. I did not track it. I filed it under one-time thing and moved forward. That is something I want you to remember as I tell you this story. I was not a careless woman. I was a trusting one. And in certain families, those two things get treated like the same thing. Over the next 2 years, small transfers happened 4 more times. Each one had an explanation: a car repair for Margaret, a medical bill that insurance did not fully cover, a deposit for a family trip that Daniel said he would pay back from his bonus. He always paid some of it back, never all of it. And every time I raised it, the conversation somehow shifted to making me feel like I was being cold or financially rigid. I want to stop here for a second and tell you what I looked like from the outside during this period of my life. From the outside, I looked like a woman who had it together. I had a steady job in hospital administration. I was involved at the girls' school. I had a good relationship with Margaret, or at least I believed I did. She called me dear and hugged me at family dinners. She told her friends I was a wonderful addition to the family. I sat at her table every Sunday for 8 years. I helped her plant tomatoes in her backyard every spring. I brought her soup when she had her first health scare. I thought she loved me. I really thought she loved me. The first moment I should have known differently happened at Lily's 10th birthday party. Margaret had organized the party at her house. I had spent 3 weeks putting together the decorations, the cake, the party favors. I spent close to $400 of my own money because Daniel said we should keep the joint account balanced that month. I did not complain, I just did it. On the day of the party, Margaret made a toast. She thanked Daniel. She thanked her other son, Brian, who had done almost nothing. She thanked a neighbor who brought a fruit tray. She did not mention me, not once. When I brought it up to Daniel that night, quietly, not angrily, he said I was being too sensitive and that his mother was just forgetful. I told myself he was probably right. I went asleep. This was the rhythm of my life for several years. I did the work, someone else got the credit, I brought it up carefully, I was told I was overreacting, I went to sleep, I woke up and did it all again. What I did not know then was that this was not a collection of accidents. It was a pattern, and patterns, once you finally see them clearly, cannot be unseen. Daniel's mother, Margaret, was diagnosed with a progressive lung disease when I was 34 years old. By that point, Lily was 15 and Gracie was 13. Our home life was full and demanding. The girls had school and sports and social lives. Daniel was working long hours, and Margaret needed increasing levels of care. Nobody asked me directly, it was more subtle than that. Margaret's doctor appointments started getting mentioned in conversations in ways that assumed I would be available. Ava, you work close to the hospital, right? Could you possibly take Mom on Tuesday? Daniel would say it casually like it was a small favor. I said yes the first time, and the second time, and the third, and eventually it stopped being a question and became an assumption. For 14 months, I drove Margaret to her pulmonologist every 3 weeks. I picked up her prescriptions. I sat with her in waiting rooms. I learned the names of her nurses. I learned which breathing exercises she needed to do each morning, and I made sure she had the equipment. I organized her insurance paperwork. I spent 11 separate evenings on the phone with her insurance company fighting claims they had denied. I won 8 of those 11 battles. During those 14 months, Margaret told me many times that she did not know what she would do without me. She held my hand in the car after difficult appointments. She told me I was the best thing that ever happened to this family. I believed her. I let those words be my payment because I loved her and because I thought love like this was its own kind of wealth. I want to be honest about something. I was also tired, not in a dramatic way, not in a way I broadcast to everyone, but in a bone-deep way that I kept mostly to myself. Daniel was not helping as much as he could have. He was not absent, but he was not present either. He would come home, ask how his mother was, eat dinner, and then disappear into work or his phone. He did not notice how much I was carrying. Or if he did notice, he chose not to acknowledge it because acknowledging it would have required doing something about it. There was one night about 9 months into Margaret's care when I broke down in our bathroom. The door was locked. I sat on the tile floor and cried for 40 minutes. I was not crying because life was hard, life is often hard. I was crying because I felt completely invisible. I had given so much of myself to everyone in that house, and I had the terrifying feeling that if I disappeared, nobody would miss what I actually contributed. They would only miss the services. That thought scared me enough to shake me. I got up off the floor, I washed my face. I went to bed, and I told myself I was being unfair to Daniel and his family. I told myself I was exhausted and reading things wrong. I was not reading things wrong. Margaret passed away on a Thursday evening in October. It had been a long final week. She was in the hospital for the last 9 days. I was there every single day. Daniel came when he could. His brother Brian flew in from out of state on day 6 and acted like his arrival was the most heroic thing that had ever happened. He brought flowers and a bottle of wine and spent most of his time in the family waiting area on his phone. I sat with Margaret. I talked to her even when she could not respond. I held her hand through the night on Thursday, and she died at 11:42 in the evening with her hand in mine. I called Daniel. He came within 20 minutes. I stepped back and let him have his grief and his time with his mother. I called the nurses. I handled the paperwork. I drove home alone at 3 in the morning because Daniel stayed with Brian at the hospital to make arrangements. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. Lily and Gracie were asleep. I sat in the kitchen alone, and I remember thinking, she is gone. I was the last person she saw. I was the one who stayed. And somewhere in the grief, I felt peace about that. I thought that meant something to this family. 3 days later, the lawyer came. His name was Mr. Calloway, and he had been the family attorney for almost 20 years. He sat at the head of the dining room table in the family home with a brown folder in front of him. Around the table sat Daniel, Brian, Brian's wife Cheryl, and me. Lily and Gracie were in the living room watching television because Daniel had said the meeting was for adults only. Mr. Calloway opened the folder and began to read. The will left the family home to Daniel and Brian in equal shares. It left a savings account of roughly $42,000 split between them. It left specific pieces of furniture and jewelry to named family members. It left a small amount to a church Margaret had attended. It was a thorough document. Mr. Calloway read every line carefully. My name was not in it. Not once. I remember sitting very still. I remember the way the afternoon light came through the window and fell across the table. I remember the sound of the television in the other room where the girls were laughing at something. I remember all of those details with extraordinary clarity because the human brain does strange things when it is absorbing a shock. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at the table. He did not look at me. Brian and Cheryl were nodding along, completely unsurprised, which meant they had known. They had already seen this document before today. This reading was a formality for them. It was only news to me. When Mr. Calloway finished, he closed the folder and asked if there were any questions. I said yes. I said quietly that I was surprised my name was not included, given my involvement in Margaret's care over the past 14 months. Mr. Calloway looked at me briefly and said the will had been updated about 8 months ago and that he was not at liberty to discuss the process, only the content. 8 months ago, that was 6 months into the most intensive period of Margaret's care. The period when I was driving her to appointments twice a month, managing her medications, fighting her insurance battles. She had updated the will during that time while I was caring for her, and she had not mentioned it, and Daniel had not mentioned it. I asked Daniel calmly on the drive home whether he had known the will had been updated. He said he had known for a while. I asked why he had not told me. He said he did not think it was his place. I looked at the road ahead of me and I said nothing for the rest of the drive. Something had shifted inside me, not broken, not shattered, shifted, like a tectonic plate that has finally moved after years of pressure. Quiet, enormous, irreversible. That night after the girls were in bed and Daniel had fallen asleep, I went to the kitchen table and I opened my laptop. I had no plans, I was not plotting anything. I was just a woman sitting alone at midnight, very awake, thinking very carefully. I started writing down numbers. I pulled up our joint bank account history going back 5 years. I pulled up every transfer, every withdrawal, every payment I had made to anything connected to Daniel's family. I made a spreadsheet. It took me about 2.5 hours. And when I was done, I sat back and looked at what I had built and something cold moved through me. Over 5 years, I had contributed or directly absorbed costs totaling approximately $63,000 that went toward Daniel's F. Amy or went missing from joint funds without my full knowledge or agreement. Some of it was clearly documented. Some of it was transfers I had allowed because I trusted the context. Some of it was medical costs I had covered when insurance failed. Some of it was money that had simply been moved and never fully explained. $63,000. I did not cry. I was past crying by that point. I just looked at the number and understood that I had been financing a family that had simultaneously been planning to exclude me. I saved the spreadsheet, I closed the laptop, I went to bed, I lay in the dark next to Daniel and thought about what kind of woman I wanted to be when I got up. I want to be honest about the next few weeks because they were not dramatic. There was no screaming, there was no confrontation. I went to work, I came home, I made dinners, I drove Lily to her volleyball practice. I helped Gracie with a history project. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, I was doing something I had never done before in 11 years of marriage. I was paying attention without softening what I saw. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to notice. I noticed that when Daniel's family called, he left the room to take the calls. He had always done this. I had always assumed it was just habit. Now I wondered what was being said that required a different room. I noticed that Brian had started calling more frequently since the funeral, multiple times a week, and Daniel seemed more anxious after those calls, not upset exactly, just tighter, more distracted. I noticed that the family home, which was now jointly owned by Daniel and Brian, had been mentioned in 2 conversations as a potential sale. Daniel had not brought this up to me directly. I had caught the edges of it. The phrase, once we sort things out and Brian wants to move forward, floated through the kitchen twice in 2 weeks. And then I noticed something that made everything else make sense. I had gone into Daniel's home office to get the printer cable because mine had stopped working. I was not snooping, I was retrieving a cable, but the printer was on and it had not finished a print job from earlier. Sitting in the paper tray was a single sheet. I almost did not look at it. I almost just took the cable and left. I looked at it. It was an email printout. It was from Brian to Daniel. It was dated about 6 weeks before Margaret had passed. The subject line was the plan going forward. I am not going to repeat every word because I still feel the cold of it when I think about it, but the relevant part, the part that told me everything, was a paragraph near the bottom where Brian wrote that as long as the property and accounts stayed family controlled, there was no reason to complicate things. He wrote that Daniel needed to think about what's practical and that Ava's contribution is personal, not legal. Ava's contribution is personal, not legal. They had discussed me, they had evaluated what I was worth to them. They had decided I was valuable as a caregiver and a household manager, but not as a person with legal standing in their family's financial future. And Daniel had participated in that conversation. He had stood in that email exchange. I could see his name in the thread header, and he had apparently agreed, or at least not disagreed loudly enough to change anything. I took a photo of that printout with my phone. I put the cable back. I walked out of the office and went back to my desk. Here is what I did not do. I did not confront Daniel that night. I did not send Brian a furious message. I did not call a friend and vent. I did not cry. I had learned by this point that emotional reaction was the one tool I had that could be used against me. If I showed how much I knew, I would lose the advantage of knowing it. Instead, I made an appointment. A week later, I sat across from a family law attorney named Ms. Reyes. I had looked up 3 attorneys before choosing her. I picked her because her online reviews specifically mentioned that she was clear, direct, and did not waste her clients' time. I brought my spreadsheet, I brought the photo of the email. I brought our marriage certificate, our joint account statements, and a folder of receipts I had quietly assembled over the previous 2 weeks. Ms. Reyes was quiet for a long time after looking through everything. Then she looked up at me and said, "You've been funding a household and a family caregiving operation while being systematically excluded from the financial benefits and estate planning of that same family. That is not a personal failure. That is a documentable pattern." Those words, documentable patterns, settled into me like an anchor. We talked for 90 minutes. I learned things that morning I wish I had known years earlier. I learned about financial contribution documentation. I learned about spousal asset rights. I learned about what constituted Marita L funds and how they could be tracked even years after the fact. I learned that the $63,000 I had documented was not just a private grief. It was a legal reality with options attached to it. Ms. Reyes advised me to do 3 things immediately. First, open a personal account completely separate from the joint account and begin routing my direct deposit there. Second, do not make any large financial decisions or allow any large transfers until we understood the full picture. Third, gather everything quietly and carefully without signaling that anything had changed. I did all 3 things within 1 week. I also did a fourth thing that Ms. Reyes had not specifically suggested, but that I felt compelled to do. I called Mr. Calloway, the family lawyer who had read the will. I introduced myself again. I told him I had a question of a personal and confidential nature about the timing of Margaret's will update. He was careful, professional, and mostly did not give me direct information. But he said one thing that mattered. He said the will had been updated by Margaret's own request at a time when he had noted she was experiencing significant cognitive fatigue, and that the session had been brief and somewhat hurried. Cognitive fatigue, brief, hurried. I thanked him and hung up. Then I called Ms. Reyes and told her what he had said. She said that was potentially very relevant. She said if it could be established that Margaret had been influenced during a period of diminished capacity, the will update could be subject to a challenge. She said it was not a guaranteed outcome, but it was a real avenue. I want to stop here and make sure you understand what was happening in my house during this period, because I do not want you to picture a cold chess game. I was still grieving Margaret in my own way. She had been my family too, even if the documents did not say so. I was still helping Lily and Gracie process their grandmother's death. I was still making dinner and folding laundry and being present for 2 teenage girls who needed steadiness. I was doing all of that while also, quietly and methodically, protecting myself from the people who had decided I was useful but not worth protecting. That is one of the hardest things to explain about situations like mine. You do not stop loving people because you discover they have used you. Love and clarity exist at the same time. I loved my family. I was also done being the person in that family who had no financial or legal standing while giving everything. About a month after my first meeting with Ms. Reyes, something happened that accelerated everything. Daniel came home one evening and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He had a look on his face that I recognized. It was the look he always had when he wanted something and knew the conversation would be uncomfortable. I had seen that look about money many times over 11 years. I waited. He said Brian wanted to sell the family home. He said the plan was to split the proceeds between the two of them. He said the amount, once the property was assessed, would likely be somewhere between $300,000 and $350,000 after the existing mortgage was paid off. He said he was planning to use his share to pay off some lingering debt and invest the rest. He did not ask me anything. He was telling me about money that would affect our household finances and our future plans without asking me a single question about what I thought. He presented it as information, not a discussion, just like the $6,000 transfer years ago, just like the will reading, just like every other moment when I had been informed instead of consulted. I nodded and said I would need a few days to think about how that affected our financial planning together. He looked slightly surprised. I think he expected me to say okay or to ask a few gentle questions and then accept his plan. I kept my face completely calm. After he went to bed, I sent Ms. Reyes a message outlining what he had told me. Her response came the next morning. She said it was time to have the full conversation about my options. She outlined two paths. The first path was to address the marital financial issues directly with Daniel through a process she could facilitate. The second path was to pursue a formal challenge of the will update on the grounds of Margaret's cognitive state during the revision. She said both paths were stronger together than either was alone. She said the email printout, combined with the financial history and Mr. Calloway's comment, built a picture that would be difficult for anyone to simply dismiss. I chose both paths. What happened over the next 6 weeks was not explosive. It was precise. Ms. Reyes sent a formal letter to Daniel, not to Brian, not to the family, to Daniel, outlining the documented marital financial contributions I had made over the course of our marriage, including the spec. IFIC transfers and amounts that had gone to family purposes without full consent or documentation. The letter was not threatening, it was informational. But what an informational letter from a family law attorney means in practice is this: the other person now knows that you know and that you have help. Daniel called me from work the day he received the letter. His voice was very different from any tone I had heard from him in years. It was not angry, it was alarmed. He said he wanted to talk. I said, of course. I said we should talk with Ms. Reyes present. There was a long pause, then he said, okay. I want to tell you about that meeting because it was one of the most important moments of my life. We sat in Ms. Reyes' conference room. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel had not brought his own attorney yet, though Ms. Reyes had suggested he do so. He came alone. He looked like a man who had not slept well. He kept turning his wedding ring around his finger. I sat across from him and I felt completely calm, not because I did not care, because I had spent 11 years being the person in that marriage who absorbed, forgave, and softened. I had no softening left to offer. What I had instead was documentation. Ms. Reyes guided the meeting. She laid out the financial timeline. She laid out the email. She laid out what Mr. Calloway had said about the circumstances of the will revision. She laid out the legal context for all of it, and then she said, Ava is not here to cause conflict. She is here because she was excluded from protections she earned and deserved. We are prepared to address this formally or cooperatively. That choice belongs to you and your family. Daniel was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, I didn't know it would come to this. I spoke for the first time in that meeting. I said, it came to this because I was told my contribution was personal, not legal. That was a decision made about me without me. I am simply making a decision about myself for myself. He looked at me, I looked back. I was not cold, I was not furious, I was just Ava, the woman he had married, the woman who had raised his daughters and cared for his mother and funded his family's stability for 11 years. Finally, completely done waiting to be seen. After that meeting, things moved quickly in some ways and very slowly in others. Daniel hired an attorney. Brian, when he found out what was happening, called Daniel furious and called me manipulative. That word was interesting to me. Manipulative. Brian, who had written an email calculating my legal worth and deciding I had none, was now describing me as manipulative for hiring a lawyer. I wrote that word down in my notes next to the date, not for any strategic reason, just because I wanted to remember how that particular form of logic works. Brian called me directly once. I did not answer. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was mostly a version of this family did a lot for you and you need to think about what you're doing. I forwarded the voicemail to Ms. Reyes. She said it was not useful as evidence but that I was right not to engage. The will challenge process took several months. I want to be honest with you that it was not swift or clean. There were depositions, there was documentation. There were multiple conversations with Mr. Calloway, who ultimately submitted a professional statement confirming that he had personal concerns about the circumstances of the will revision that he had not felt empowered to raise at the time but felt professionally obligated to note now. His statement did not destroy the will, but it weakened it considerably. During this period, Brian and Daniel had to make a choice. They could fight the challenge and risk a full legal process that would make the financial history of their family very public and very documented, or they could negotiate. They negotiated. The settlement was this: I would receive a lump sum representing a portion of what I had documented contributing to the family, not everything, but a significant and real amount. I would also receive a formal documented acknowledgement of my marital contribution to the household over the full course of the marriage. The family home sale would proceed, but a portion of Daniel's share would be directed to address the marital financial imbalance Ms. Reyes had documented. It was not everything I deserved, but it was real, and it was mine in writing with signatures on it. I also made one other decision during this period that had nothing to do with money. About 4 months into the legal process, I moved out of the family home. This was not a dramatic exit. I did not slam doors or pack bags dramatically at midnight. I found a small, clean apartment about 20 minutes from the house. I gave the girls both of my new contact information the same day I moved. I told them both separately and gently that I loved them and that nothing between me and their father changed in. "I think about my relationship with them," Lily cried. Gracie was very quiet for a long time and then hugged me and did not let go for several minutes. "I want you to know that those two girls, who were not biologically mine, who I had chosen, who I had shown up for in every ordinary way for 11 years, those girls were the part of this story that lived in my heart differently from everything else. They had not betrayed me. They were not responsible for the decisions their father and uncle had made. And the thought of them growing up and possibly understanding one day that I had left without making sure they knew I still chose them, that was the thought I could not accept. So I made sure they knew. I settled into my apartment. I relearned what my own life felt like when I was not managing everyone else's. I cooked for myself. I slept without that low-grade tension I had lived with for years. I bought a plant. I took long walks in the morning before work. I called my own mother more. I started reading books again, something I had not done consistently in years because there had always been something else that needed my attention. I want to be very honest about something. This period of my life was not triumphant every day. There were evenings when I sat alone and felt the weight of what had ended. Not the marriage exactly. By the time I left, the marriage had been a set of shared obligations more than a real partnership for a long time. What I grieved was the family I had believed I was part of. The idea of Sunday dinners and daughters who called me by name and a mother-in-law who had held my hand and called me the best thing. The grief for the imagined version was real even when the real version had proved hollow. But here is what I discovered about grief when you finally stop running from it. It ends, not all at once, not neatly, but it ends. And on the other side of it, there is this quiet that is not emptiness, it is space. Space you did not know you needed because you had been filling it with other people's crises for so long you had forgotten what your own interior sounded like. My interior, it turned out, had a lot to say. About 7 months after I moved out, the divorce was finalized. It was not bitter in the courtroom sense, it was just done. The terms were fair because Ms. Reyes had made them fair. I walked out of that courthouse on a Tuesday morning in April and I stood on the sidewalk in the spring air and I thought, I am 40 years old and I am completely free. Not free in a way that means nothing matters, free in a way that means what happens next is entirely mine. That afternoon, I went back to my apartment and I made a list, not of grievances, not of losses, a list of things I wanted to do, things I had put in a corner of my mind for years and covered with other people's needs. There were 14 things on that list. I started with number 3 because it scared me the least. I signed up for a continuing education program in healthcare leadership. Something I had thought about for years and never pursued because there was always something more urgent. Something that belonged to someone else. I also want to tell you about what happened with Lily and Gracie. Lily was 17 by the time the divorce was final. She was old enough to understand a version of what had happened, though I never gave her the full detail, it was not her weight to carry. She was angry at her father for a while, not because I had said anything, but because she was old enough to observe and smart enough to read the room. One evening, she showed up at my apartment with takeout from the Thai place I loved, and she sat on my couch and said, "I know what they did wasn't fair." I told her she did not need to take sides. She said, "I'm not taking sides, I'm just telling you that I see it." That was one of the most meaningful things anyone said to me during that entire period. Gracie came around more slowly. She was quieter and closer to her father. I gave her space. I never pushed. I checked in regularly and gently, and I let her come to me on her own timeline. About a year after the divorce, she called me on a Sunday afternoon out of nowhere and asked if she could visit for the weekend. She stayed 2 nights. We cooked together and watched movies and talked about her plans after high school. She did not bring up the past. She did not need to. She just showed up. And I realized that what I had built with those girls over 11 years could not be legally removed from either of us because it had never been a document. It had been a daily choice to show up, and that kind of thing leaves a mark that no one can delete. Now I want to tell you about Brian's. About 8 months after the settlement, I heard through a mutual family contact that Brian and Cheryl were having serious financial difficulties. The family home had been sold, and Brian's share had gone faster than expected into some investments that had not performed. He W. As apparently frustrated about the settlement amount because he had counted on a different number. The version of events, according to my contact, was that Brian told people I had taken money from the family by using legal tricks. I heard this and felt almost nothing, not satisfaction exactly, not anger, something closer to clarity. A man who had written in an email that my contribution was personal, not legal, was now upset that I had used legal tools to protect myself. The irony was so complete it barely needed comment. He called me once more about a year after everything was settled. I do not know what he expected. The message he left was shorter than the first one and much quieter. He said he hoped things were okay. He said he thought about his mother a lot. He said he was sorry things had gotten so complicated. I listened to the message 3 times, then I deleted it. I did not call back, not because I wanted to punish him, because I was genuinely done. There was nothing to say that the last 2 years had not already said much better than any phone call could. I also want to tell you about Daniel, because he is complicated in the way that only a person you once truly loved can be complicated. Daniel and I are not enemies, we are not friends. We are two people who were married for 11 years and are now not. We speak occasionally about the girls. He is polite, I am polite. He looks in the times I have seen him since the divorce like a man who is in the process of understanding something about himself that is uncomfortable. I do not wish him harm. I do not wish him particular happiness either. I wish him enough self-awareness to be better for the next person than he was for me, not because she deserves my concern, I do not know her, but because I know what it costs to be in a life where your contributions are quietly counted and found to be personal, not legal. If he learns that lesson, something good will have come from the pain. If he does not, that is his weight to carry now, not mine. Here is where I am today. I am 41 years old. I have my own apartment. I have a growing career in healthcare leadership that I am genuinely proud of. I have a continuing education certificate on my wall that I earned by showing up for myself the way I showed up for everyone else for over a decade. I have a small, honest circle of friends who know who I actually am, not who I made myself useful to be for others. I have a relationship with Lily and Gracie that is ours, not defined by marriage, not dependent on a family structure, just two young women and a woman who chose them and kept choosing them even when everything else changed. I have a savings account with a number in it that I built myself, from money that no one transferred out without asking. I have mornings that belong to me. I have evenings that are mine to spend however I choose. I have a life that is smaller in some ways than what I had and enormous in the ways that matter. And I have this story. I do not tell it to make myself look brave. I do not tell it so you will feel sorry for me. I tell it because I spent 11 years making myself small and serviceable in a family that was quietly planning to keep me that way permanently. I tell it because I almost did not notice. I tell it because the moment I did notice, I had a choice to keep being invisible or to become inconveniently visible, and I chose inconvenient. I tell it because somewhere out there, someone is sitting at a kitchen table at midnight running their own numbers and feeling the cold settle in. Someone is realizing that the person they built a life for has been having a different conversation about them in another room. Someone is trying to decide whether noticing the truth makes them dramatic or whether they have actually been right all along. You have not been dramatic. You have been right all along. The people who called you too sensitive needed you to be too sensitive. The people who called you dramatic needed you not to look too closely. The people who said it was not about the money needed it to not be about the money, because the moment it became about the money, the paperwork would tell a story they could not control. Let me tell you what I know now that I did not know then. Quiet does not mean gone, patience does not mean permission, loyalty does not mean unlimited access. Love is not a legal document and it is not a ledger, but when the people around you start treating it like one, start calculating what you are worth and what they can take and what you will let them keep, you are allowed to pick up a pen. You are allowed to do your own math. You are allowed to walk into a lawyer's office with a spreadsheet and a photo of a printed email and say, I see the pattern, here it is, documented. Now let's talk about what's fair. That is not betrayal, that is not revenge. That is a person who finally decided she deserved to be in the room. I came back stronger, not louder. Not angrier, not bitter and sharp in ways that would have made me smaller. Stronger, cleaner, more mine than I had been in 11 years. And I want you to know, whatever table you have been sitting at, whatever family or partner or person has been deciding your worth in rooms you were not invited into, you can stand up. You can do it quietly. You can do it with documentation. You can do it with a calm voice and a very good attorney and a spreadsheet that tells the truth better than any argument ever could. You can come back. Not for them, for you. That is the only kind of coming back that lasts. If Ava's story felt familiar to you in any way, if you have ever been the person who gave everything and was thanked by no one, who was told you were overreacting when you were actually just paying attention, who kept the peace while someone else quietly planned the next move, I want you to leave a comment. You do not have to share your whole story. You can just say, I see this. Because sometimes the most powerful thing is knowing that someone else has been in that room and made it out. If this story meant something to you, share it with one person who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, real, painful, and ultimately earned, you know where to find them.